And we're going to go with the first question that we always ask, which is, what did you think about this week? What was significant for you? And all that. So who wants to start? Does anybody want to volunteer? Or do I need to start picking on people?
I'll be happy to volunteer.
Okay. Go ahead, Mama.
I discovered I really didn't know anything about James. I didn't. I mean, I knew he was a disciple, but when I read this chapter, most everything, I don't know. I just either missed it or just didn't remember the stories. So I didn't know much about him. I found the one thing that I found really interesting was on page 81, where this author explained the Samaria and the Samaritans and that kind of relationship with the Jews, and because I didn't really remember any of that. But in the minute I read that, it took me right back to that. Scott?
Nathan, are we recording?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
And it took me right back to that the video on The Chosen, where you remember Jesus was walking with his disciples, and the disciples immediately stopped and said, "We can't go in there. That's Samaria." And Jesus said, "Well, no, we're going through there." And so this kind of, to me, explained their reaction a little bit more. So that's what I liked about it. That's what I found interesting.
And to jump off of what Cindy was talking about, there's a sentence on page 82 that kind of made me think twice. They were talking about what the Samaritans' religion was like and all that. And the sentence said, "The Samaritans' religion is a classic example of what happens when the authority of Scripture is subjugated to human tradition." I just thought that was a very interesting line, just because I think that's what happens. Some religions have gotten that way, where there's so much tradition put in that you forget what the religion's about, you know? That was kind of my thought when I read that one. Dave, you have anything?
No, I didn't know too much about James either, but one thing I thought was kind of interesting was he was the first disciple to be martyred, and
Yeah.
and of course he was a brother of John. I knew that, but didn't know a whole lot more about him.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting how it mentions that he never mentioned alone. It's always James and John. When he's mentioned, it's always James with his brother John. When the only time he's mentioned in Scripture, when he's martyred, when he's mentioned, that's the only time he's mentioned alone.
Lundgren?
Well, to carry on from the Samaritans, I was fascinated with that story and how when James wanted to call down fire from heaven to kill off the bad Samaritans who were mistreating them. Well, they were being mistreated because there was this huge. It was like a race issue almost. You had them intermarrying over there and collecting other thoughts, as well as being half-breeds as they talked about them. But then Jesus put kind of a squelch on that, and it turned out that later on, when they started Christianizing the various sects of Judaism, that the Samaritans accepted Christianity probably better than most any of the other Jewish sects. So if they had rained fire down from heaven and wiped out all those who were bad to them, I bet that probably never would have happened.
Yeah.
But the word that I got stuck on was Saloma. Was she not in The Chosen? Was she at the wedding feast? Was there a family contact there between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and James and John. Anybody remember that?
I didn't read The Chosen.
Yeah, I didn't get to watch the Chosen. So I'm not sure on that one.
So I don't think that she was actually at the wedding feast, but there was an instance where they returned to the house of James and John, and it is Zebedee and his wife.
Right.
But and that's where they're gathered around, and Jesus kind of teaches, and they lower the man from the from the roof. Yep, the paralytic. But I don't remember if she's ever named, as in her name is ever mentioned.
I was just wondering if James and John grew up with Jesus after he returned from Egypt.
No, they wouldn't have grown up together.
Well, there is some scholars believe that there's a part in the Bible where it's rethink this. Where John and James actually might be Jesus's cousin, but it's relying on, and I'll look it up here in a second and kind of re-interject. It's at the crucifixion where it's Mary's sister and someone else. Some scholars think that Mary's sister is reference to her, but.
All right.
I also found that to be a very interesting relationship, because throughout the New Testament, only occasionally do you find out how Jesus was able to get practical things taken care of. You know, how did they eat their meals every day? Where did they stay at night? And then apparently Salome was part of this group of women that would fix them meals, that would fund their meals, that would take care of them. You had who was the guy who at the end they needed to have a tomb for Jesus, and so then that guy popped out of obscurity and into the limelight and took care of the tomb for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've read ahead, so the thing with James, for me, it's kind of like, I'm gonna call my mom in to help me get higher stat. You know, I'm gonna call my mom because my family is really important and we're important. Therefore, we're important, so we should be held in a higher status. And I found it fascinating with all of these guys that no matter what Jesus, Karen and I were talking about this when we were eating, no matter what Jesus did and taught and showed, they still argued among themselves. I mean, they're totally human, and that's human nature. But I said, you know, Karen, if Jesus came and asked me to drop everything and follow, and if I did that, I don't know that I would be wanting to be, you know, held way up here next to him with all the other people that are around him. I don't know that I would, because that just seems like, oh my God, you've dropped everything. How can you now want to call in mom to help you, you know,
solve your problem.
Solve it, really.
Hey mom, I need help.
It's just fascinating.
But on the other side of that coin, look how arrogant Peter was, and how time around Christ hindered that. And I read about all the ultimate zealous attitude that James had. And one of the parting lines is it's clear proof of him changing. Well, I believe he changed because he spent time around Christ. He saw how things could be. I found it interesting, though, that he was the first martyred apostle, and he was not martyred alone. That's the thread I've seen throughout this, is seeing all of these human traits that we see in each other that are some good, but hard to control. Some, I don't want to say bad, but strong-willed and unable to control. And yet, Jesus took the time without strong, like a parent slapping them around, and just kind of lifted them up or gently chastised them, and they turned into what he was wanting them to turn into. And I like the fact that, we have free will. He could have made us, he could have made the apostles do what he wanted. That would not work. They had to come into this of their own. They had to evolve through him for this to really take hold. For them to become, I don't want to say believers, because they were believers at first, but I think the final analysis to me is when they become what he was hoping of them. They believed that they could follow him, that they could lead others to him, that they could become what he wanted of them.
We're going to keep going, but you actually just hit on one of my biggest points in the next slide. So we'll get to that in a second. Deborah, do you want to share? How about Karen? Karen, do you want to share? Did you share anything?
No, she said no.
No.
Okay, well then we'll go right into that next slide for that first question that Kimball just kind of.
Before we do, I actually found the reference where it was saying some scholars kind of think it's Jesus' cousins, maybe.
Oh yeah.
Mark chapter 15, verse 40. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome. Then in John chapter 19, 25, near the cross of Jesus stood Jesus' mother, his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. His mother's sister and Salome are the two that are different. But going back to Mark, it also does say many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So it's a debate because yet again, we have the Gospels don't really have any other reference. So I kind of figured I'd introduce that.
And first and foremost, did I miss anybody? I think I did miss Pastor. Pastor wanted to share.
Nope, you're good.
You're good. Okay. Actually, I was going to also realize I didn't share my point that hit me hard on this read. It's when James, he mentions that James and John during the fire from the heavens, I can't find the quote right now, but he says that he's asking Jesus for them to be able to do something that he won't do. And that was kind of one of those weird dualities that I was thinking about, going like, well, Jesus in the past would bring down fire, but that's not what his purpose is now. And we sometimes jump to those conclusions and go, can I do it? And he's like, no, just hold up for a second. So this was everything on this slide of what we kind of learned this week about James. Very much of a very passionate man that his father was high to do. His mother was also following Jesus and also went to ask Jesus for them to sit on their left and the right, that he was the older brother of the two of them. He was a very passionate and zealot and energetic person. And I can't read the other ones. And that he was also the first to be martyred. But my first question for everybody is, are you seeing a pattern with the apostles? Of the apostles that we've learned now, there's 3 of them. Are you seeing kind of a pattern? Like I said, Kimball really kind of already mentioned it, but anybody else seeing any others? Okay. The one that I always saw was that, like Kimball was saying, that we see these human traits and that each one of them had to learn something to come closer to God, to do what God asked them. Were you guys surprised that James and John's mother was one of the followers? Had you ever thought about that their family members were a part of this group that was following behind? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I've still always thought there were just 12 men plus Jesus. Like I said a few weeks ago, just like he sounds more like, I don't even know how to describe it in modern day terms, but just someone who had this following that just went with him from city to city. And I don't know how many miles it stretched. The more I read this, it kind of seems like it was a closer area, like they weren't traveling from Texas to Florida to, obviously, you know what I mean? But maybe North Texas versus, Southern. But the fact that there were more than 12, because once he called the 12, I don't know what I thought happened to the other people personally. I really don't. But and I never really realized that James and John's parents stayed connected. I figured when they left the fishing boat, because I always wondered, how could they give up everything and never see it again? I felt the same way about Peter's wife. I thought he just left and I didn't know what happened to her. I mean, I was like, would she not have? So there's all these little things that I don't guess we cover as much in Bible stories, or the pieces don't get put together, amongst all the scriptures. So no, I'm still thinking there's about 20 people hanging out with Jesus and that's about it. So yeah.
But Cheryl, that would make sense. Yeah, that would make sense then when they're talking about where they're sleeping and where they're getting their food and what. Yeah. So with these people, it was all the other people around them that were going out and procuring all of this stuff for them in advance. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, that just seems logical now that you're saying that. That just seems logical.
It does, but I don't know why it didn't occur to me since 5 years old when I started hearing this stuff or whatever. But anyway, something new to learn every day, right?
Yeah, I found it was interesting that James was well-to-do and well-connected, and they gave the example of how he knew the high priests, and that's how Peter got into the courtyard there. But I was also wondering, I was thinking maybe that's why it took a king to actually kill him. None of the lower aristocrats or bureaucrats would dare touch somebody who was as well connected and well-to-do as what James was. And maybe that's why he was killed with a sword rather than hanging on a cross. It would be a much quicker way of going, be a lot easier. You wouldn't want to antagonize his parents, apparently.
Get me.
Yeah, there is an idea there of much of this chapter or this book, really, we're able to see a bigger picture as to who the people were. I'll just give you some insight like this. On a family vacation, you typically see the pictures where everyone's smiling and happy. We don't often have the pictures of the kids yelling in the back seat going, "Are we there yet? He's on my side. What do you mean?" So we're getting to see a little bit bigger picture here. And I think to Cheryl's point, though, too, when we think about the scriptures, it is at a distance of time that we're not necessarily experiencing what they're experiencing. Probably when they're walking around, it's probably a maximum of 50 miles in one direction. So the distance that we're talking is small relative to our insights. But keep in mind this, they're also walking it. It's not by car, it's not even by horse. It's by your own two God-given feet. And so it gives you a different perception of, in a given day, there may be walking 7 to 10 feet, 10 miles in order to really cover some distance. And that's if they're really pushing. But then when they get into a larger group, it slows you down. And so you need that that mom to help keep things organized and accountable, or to James and John to go to mom and be like, how did you always organize the potluck dinners? Oh, well, the ladies just got it together. Let me just do it for you.
I was going to add, when Eric, you asked the question about, do I see similarities? It seems to me that James and Peter, personality-wise, are similar. They're, passionate, zealous. They, what did they call Peter, the disciple who put his foot in his mouth, or what? I don't remember that. But, it kind of seems that they have that in common. And then every time I think, well, my goodness, how did you, how or why would Jesus have called them? I just remember the title of this book. They were just 12 ordinary men that had a faith, and he called them, and then he led them to do great things for him.
Sorry, trying to unmute. Try to mute so I'm not too loud over here. Kind of leading into the next question, you guys kind of started mentioning it earlier, is what is your feelings and thoughts about the fact that James and John's mother actually asked Jesus to sit on the left and the right? And then on top of that, I always thought it was kind of interesting that it was the women that were providing the money also, and kind of what y'all's thoughts on that is. I know, growing up, it was, well, not growing up, but like the ideal that I always had in my head about the Bible was it was the man's job to get the money, and the woman to provide for the household and everything in that manner. And then at this point, it's kind of flipped when I read this, and it made me start questioning and thinking and asking questions. So kind of putting that out onto you guys, what you guys think about that.
Well, it was the generation older than Jesus, James and so if it's anything like it is today, you go over to a nursing home and 75% of the people there are women, because the husbands have already died out earlier.
I'm going to go back to the saying, a man's home is his castle, right, dear? I mean, truly, that's a joke, but if you look back, how many times has the patriarch or the male ruler in a situation succumbed or gone to counsel with their female counterparts?
Yeah, you're right. It's usually the man is the head of the household, but the woman is the neck, turning where to look and saying, don't look that way, go over here.
You don't think I'm guiding you, but I am.
We're a lot more subtle than that, Nathan. But so Eric, I'll try to keep it short. But when you asked the question, it made me think of my grandmother on my mom's side. Now that my aunt has passed, she apparently saved everything. I mean, we're talking letters and notes. She has stuff, when she first got married, from my grandmother. Well, my cousin is going through all of this and brought me one of the notes. And in a nutshell, my aunt and uncle had just moved into a new home. And my grandmother, to save, I think she said to save 5 cents postage, was sending this letter back with my mother to give to her sister. And in it must have been some kind of money, because she had said, I'm sending something for your new house. I hope you buy some. And what Diana said she's found in reading some of the letters is it was my grandmother who would subtly and quietly send money to some of the kids through different periods of life. How she whether she saved it from the household fund, who knows how she did it. But my grandfather either didn't know about it or wasn't a part of it, whatever it was. That was just kind of her role. And it was to take care of people. She wasn't here and she just wanted them to have something. So that made me think of her, because sometimes I don't know how dads are with their kids, but I do know how moms are. And I mean, Eric, my daughter Kayla. So it's not uncommon for Kayla or Matt to find that I'm the one who's usually more worried about stuff like that. So I don't know if it's a mom thing or not.
I think it is probably a parent thing for sure, but definitely moms. There's a special bond between kids and moms, of course. And yeah, the other thing that hearing you guys all talk about everything is how important women were even in the beginning of the church, and how we kind of walked away from that a little bit through the history of the church being so prevalent. And partly it's because it's not mentioned in the church or in the Bible. Like, you have to read into it a little bit more. Last one.
If the moms are saying to the dads that it's for the grandbaby, what can a dad say?
Well, the thing that I kind of noted or realized is there's a couple points in the gospel where it mentions how much they had in the pocket or in the treasury at that time of the disciples. And it always seemed like it was a lot of money, 5 months salary, 2 months, 500 denarii, something like that. And kind of thinking of, okay, well, there's Jesus and the 12 disciples. They didn't need that much money, so why aren't they giving it away to the poor? And then realizing, oh, wait, there was 70 disciples at one point. We know there was 5,000 that came out to see him, and that's just the men, not the women and children. It kind of makes more sense that they had to kind of keep track of that, and why these women kind of traveling around with him and financing, why he needed the financing to be able to do the missionary work on earth.
I think you also hit on a really interesting point. You said, and the families. These are the families of the men that we're counting in the following. It's their families coming along. So those are their women's and their children and stuff like that. So this was a family event to some extent of we're going as a family to follow this guy. Yeah. Any more thought?
I'll chime in with just one more thing here. Typically, it was the man who was the breadwinner, and it was his main focus was to earn as much as he could to make sure everyone survived. When you were in the lower classes, especially, then the wife would also contribute, where she would be cooking or cleaning for other households, or doing work to be able to sell goods then to other families, like making cheeses or butters or different things like that. And so the wealthier you were, then your wife would not have to work, where then she would have her own servant, she would have her own people that would just take care of her or the other parts of the family. And so it really did note your class as to where it or what your wife was doing.
This just kind of came across my mind of kind of different kinds of culture, and throughout the history here in America, we've actually walked away from generational living of multiple people in the household. We're kind of going towards that again, but because of financials. But in other cultures, in like China and other places, the head of the house, you had 3 to 4 generations living within one house at a time. So even if a group of family left, I mean, you still have family still there or even coming with you. So the people that were following might have been 4 or 5 generations following as well, not just young 20-year-olds, or like John was probably the eldest out of all the disciples. You're shaking your head. Or James, sorry. James was the eldest. But, that means that there was tons of people of different ages underneath that as well. I'm going to go to the next question if nobody else has anything else to add.
Eric, I'm going to interrupt you. I was just going to say, I found this experience, what you're talking about, kind of, when Christopher decided to go to seminary and he had a wife and a baby. I was amazed at the churches, like the churches they had either grown up in or they had been a part of or they were members of. One church would volunteer to pay their rent at a certain time. Another one would pay another expense, and they would say, well, I'm going to put $300 or $400 every month in their account. There was a food pantry on the seminary campus, and the churches in that area in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, they all donated to that food pantry. And so any seminary student could go get that food to help them. I was just amazed, and it made me kind of think about this as you are talking, how followers, believers, Christians, Lutherans, all really went in and were helping these young, and not all young, because Chris was 30 something when he went in. He was not young, but we're helping them kind of make it. I don't know what pastor's experience was in seminary, but that was, something that they got lots of help from lots of people.
You mentioned the idea of multi-generational families, and with COVID-19, there's been a huge increase in the number of boomerang children that are coming back into the families. But just in the last few weeks, it seems like I've heard friends talk several times about how their parents are going to be moving back closer to them so that they're able to take care of them, so they don't have to go into a nursing home and be exposed to that kind of environment now, because it's so dangerous to be in a nursing home.
Very true. And we're now starting to see that differently. 2 years ago, it would have been looked down upon living with your family or but now it's very much like, no, that's the love of a family, is reaching out and being. And I love the fact that we're kind of shifting our view here in the States of how we're looking at how families are interacting, and it's celebrating that the family connection. So, Pastor, you have something to add? You unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of chime in and say this is giving us some evidence too as to our own churches and how it is a community that Christ calls us to not simply be a small group focused only on ourselves, but then there's different groups outside of that where it is the 12, then the 70, then the large group of 5,000. I mean, we're talking about not just one group then. We're talking about several different communities that no matter where you go, there's your brother and sister. So if you're on a journey, if you're traveling to a new place, you have a home. You have someone who's willing to take care of you, because you look and you see an ordinary person just like you. You don't see a stranger to be afraid of.
Well said. And this is a 12 right here, a close 12. Well, probably more like 15 of us. But so I'm going to get to the last question on this slide. We do have another slide. So this is about Peter's death. What are your feelings and your thoughts about his death, his martyrism, but also the fact that he was the first? And we also heard a story within this book about the early, or his death. It's not written in the Bible, but what are your feelings about that?
I was a little bit surprised that the first martyr was like 14 years later after Jesus. I was thinking that it would have been a lot sooner.
Well, Scott actually has a little bit of research that he found out that he was telling me about. If you wanted to kind of chime in to kind of share a little bit of that.
Sure. So James, shortly after Pentecost, and with the 14-year window, it's shortly is a couple years after at the latest, or after Christ's death. James actually traveled first. I forgot the name of the island, but he traveled first to an island and then wound up in Spain, is what a lot of scholars seem to believe. And he followed a Roman highway along kind of Spain's coast, because it looks like that might have been the second most populated area of Jews, not Rome or some of the other areas, but Spain, dating back to the Philistines, because Old Testament actually says that I forgot which. I want to say it was Alexander the Great would send envoys up to Tyre, which is believed to be Spain of the time, Spain today. I am completely losing this thought, but he James. So basically, that was where the Jews were, or a second group established really on the southern coast, and it's believed that James went there and preached throughout Spain, which would also make it interesting because that's also the area where it was the Spanish who discovered the route to India through or sailing around the Cape of Africa, and also Christopher Columbus sailing then to America. So James kind of would have set the stage for that 1,400 years later or 1,500 years later.
Well, we're also noticing kind of a trend here of, James going to Spain, and then it was Andrew that went north and over, and then, Peter also going and living with the Gentiles. It was very much like, I'm going to get up and go. So if they were moving all the time, it was probably very hard to get caught at times as well. The fact that James was actually preaching and got captured is kind of a big deal. And to the point where, one of his captors actually admits that he's a Christian as well. And in front of these people that are already trying to kill James, and apologizes, and then gets crucified, or not crucified, but gets martyred with him, is kind of a testimony of the power of that love of Christianity. And that sometimes we do have to step up and say what needs to be said in those moments.
Well, and James, when he returned, it would have been about 42 or 43 AD. So he wasn't back in Jerusalem for more than a year or two before being martyred. So something tells me he had to kick up quite a bit of a ruckus.
So part of the reason too he returned back to Jerusalem is it was around the time when Herod, who was king when Jesus was crucified, had died, and his nephew had taken over. And there was some hope that in that there would have been a political change and a different kind of idea of acceptance. However, while he was there with family and friends to see them, it was also recognized that this was not the case.
So I wanted to mention one last thing on this slide. So if you notice, we've been putting up symbols every time of our apostles. So the one on the right is a sword, because he was beheaded by a sword. And then the three shells represent him going out and preaching and traveling. Yeah. So we're going to move on to the next one for me, Scott. And you're going to have to get off of the presenter mode so you can type.
All right.
So you guys can see my questions below. Kind of like last week, I kind of want this to be a little bit more just everybody kind of chiming in. My first one is because we kind of mentioned how the Samaritans mixed tradition and worship and how that guy kind of got washed out and they forgot certain things. So my question is, what are we doing that could be thought of as the same way? When are we worshiping the tradition of something, and when are we worshiping God? And do we make mistakes in that?
Well, I think we probably worship tradition every time we get together to some extent. Pentecost, Advent, all this is tradition based on good things, but it's tradition.
Well, Scott, you're saying something?
I think I misspelled calendar. It's ER, right?
You're asking me? There's a reason why I asked you to type.
No, you have spelled it correctly, Scott. That
Thank you. Correct. It's been a long day.
I would tend to agree with Kimball. He just got off mute faster than I did. Because I think sometimes we all are so steeped in our traditions that, I joke. Because I've been to different churches, right? But I was raised Lutheran. So before I say this, just know that. But I was even commenting to my husband during this COVID time. We did communion kind of virtual. We've been doing communion virtually, and I've even talked to my Catholic friends. I said, for Lutherans to have a service without communion is like it doesn't exist. Whereas when I was attending the Baptist church, once every 3 or 4 months, you might have communion. I likened it. It's no different than birthday cake on my kids' birthdays. It doesn't make their birthday, but it's just something you do. It's not that big of a deal. So sometimes I think in different, not just Lutherans, but for all of us, we get stuck. We have to have this. This must come before this. We can't worship unless we do this. And one of the good things I think that is coming out of our lifestyle changes in the last few months is we're learning that we can do an awful lot that we've never done before, or that that God can turn what we don't think is going to work into something that's very workable. But I think sometimes we just get stuck, like Kimball was saying. We have to do this for Advent. We have to put the tree up on this date. We have to put this. We have to do that. And we have to, you can't put Jesus in the manger before this date because heaven knows the church walls would crumble. And I just feel like sometimes because it's comfortable, right? You come in, you say the same things. Mix it up, Nathan. Mix it up one Sunday and see what happens. But you come in, you do this, 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 and this. And if we don't do it that way, then something's wrong, I think is what we sometimes think. So.
Well, in defense of Nathan, I think he has mixed up some things, like he changes the center aisle from being diagonal to being 90 degrees. And then you can feel how it changes when you go through your routine. But there's so much to the routine that I like. I like the candles. I like the music. I like the liturgy. But I know it's just part of the tradition.
Well, now we don't have a center aisle. I was in church the other week, and it's a free for all. No, I'm just kidding. It's a good free for all. It's great. I loved it.
12 feet apart from everybody. It's 12 feet apart from everybody.
So there's
Thank you, Jim.
No center aisle.
That is something right now. We are kind of all over the place, and we are learning what is tradition, but truly what is worship. I think you're absolutely right, Cheryl.
And to know what those differences are, I think is a big key. So knowing that you like a tradition is different than holding on to it tooth and nail, because when you do that, then you're worshiping that tradition and not worshiping what the Lord is. The best example I have on this is actually my brother, Chris. It got to the point where it was taking their church over 30 minutes for communion because they were doing it the same way every time for the last 25 years. And it got to hundreds of people being there. and they all wanted to go up and kneel. Well, it was just impractical. So they started doing drive-by, what we call drive-by communion. And people were furious. And they were saying things like, this isn't Lutheran, this isn't, worshiping, we're not really understanding, we're not, all these little things. And he kept asking, are you worshiping going up there and doing that? Because if that's really what you want, come talk to me and we can arrange something later. Or are you worshiping God and not the practice of that motion? And that really started getting people to think a lot. And that's why it happened to actually, we brought up, me and Chris talked about this book and this chapter during all that when he gave me a call to talk about it. So it's kind of a round robin. Anything else about traditions and worship?
I'll just add, one of the things that I think COVID has taught us is, once again, churches started in the home, and started with families worshiping together, really. And, if you think about even in the pioneer days, even the days when my grandparents, they were not pioneers, but they'd be by themselves, out. They owned acreage. They didn't get in a horse and buggy and ride to town all the time to go to church. That's not practical. So they would have church in their homes. They would have it in their living room with their family, read the Bible, say the prayers, whatever. And I think, if nothing else, COVID has taught us that church didn't stop because we couldn't go to the building. I want to go back to the building, but it didn't stop.
Well, I think you could look at the tradition as anything that we go back to saying, well, we've always done it this way. Or of course it has to be this way.
Yeah.
The moment that's your defense, it's the tradition, not the worship. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with tradition, as long as it's recognizing what it is and why you're doing it.
And remember, a very famous musical made a whole song out of tradition. Fiddler on the Roof, if you guys didn't get the reference.
Can I be a rich man?
No, it's If I Were a Rich Man.
Yeah, if I were. You didn't make it to it. If I were.
So, Cindy, in the vein of what you were talking about, I got into some pro bono work in my business several years ago with a rather large church in town that would take new ordinations and put them in a home in a community, literally put them and their family in a home in a community and say, start. I got to go in and do some plumbing work and fix it up and see these people and see what they were putting them in bad communities where there were gangs running rampant and stuff. And the main thing they started with was building community. It was so awesome to see how these people would start coming together and looking out for each other, and then coming into the home to share their beliefs. And like you said, I think that's the way church started.
That's also how this church started. It was a group of friends that came together, and they started in a room, or in a building or in one of their houses, and started sharing. And then they ended up going into a church or into a school, reaching out to ELCA saying, hey, can we get a pastor here? All of a sudden we got a pastor. Then ELCA helped us get land, and then we built on that land, and then we have the building that we have today, and then we built again. So exactly right. I mean, it starts small, and when you plant that seed, it can grow huge. So due to time also.
Well, I've got one that I just want to make sure gets on there, because it's one that we may think about now. Is Reformation Sunday. when we come around to it, we always have to sing one particular song because it was written by Martin Luther, and if we don't sing it, it's never going to be Reformation Sunday. A Mighty Fortress is Our God is a very great song, but in some regards, it becomes tradition that is worshipped. So I'll just throw that out there.
Well said.
Well, as long as we can sing it some other time.
So the next question is, now knowing more about the Samaritans and the history of the Samaritans with the Jews, how do you take the stories about the Samaritans? One, the Good Samaritan. We also have the lady at the well, and we also have the person that he healed. Do you see it differently now that you know that there was so much strife and history behind the two literally hating each other for generations?
I mean, if I can jump in on that one, for me, it's realizing that what Jesus is saying is a Pharisee and a Sadducee. So present day, it'd be like pastors or priests walking by, and then you get the Samaritans who kind of are a blended religions that, I don't know, agnostic or something along those lines. And Christ is still saying, hey, these guys who do believe, not right, but they're close, still better than y'all who are trying to stay clean over helping people.
I see the Samaritans as the modern day racial issue that we have in this country, the systemic racism between the Samaritans and the rest of the Jews.
I agree, and you're jumping questions. Which is okay. So I'll chime in. The first time I read this, and what really impacted me of understanding what the Samaritans were, was the fact that enemies don't have to be enemies. And what is different from me doesn't have to always be wrong. We can do kindness and love, and it doesn't matter what religion or whatever. God works in so mysterious ways that it can be a Muslim that walks up and helps me, and that was the calling of God, to put that Muslim there to help me in that situation, because I was in that situation. We don't have to be, because they didn't believe that the Samaritans believed in the same thing. They thought they were the most heathen out there. We have that, so that was what I first took out of it.
So I'll just ask the question, how many of you knew the history that he had really talked about from First Kings, or from that past that he really highlighted in the chapter? I see a lot of people shaking their heads nope, didn't know that history. Maybe a little bit.
I mean, a little bit about Elijah and the fire from heaven kind of stuff.
Yeah. But
Sure.
it makes you realize why the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, was so shocking.
Exactly.
To the Jewish people, because they did not look at this. I mean, it makes you understand how and why they looked at him, and why that seemed just so shocking to them.
Yes.
I think it was actually around that point where because he had so many followers that people started walking away from him. He was teaching such radical things that they were like, no, what are you talking about? This is wrong. And people would start turning their backs on him.
Well, and you brought up a point, Eric, going back to something Nathan said earlier, because it is now 2,000 years later, we don't get that shock value anymore.
Yep.
Which actually comes to my last question. Who are the Samaritans today for us? And that is in a Christian whole view. That can be an American view. That can be a personal view. And when you say something as a whole, it does not mean that personally or anything like that. Jim already brought out a racist one, so we want to write that down if you want to say anything else on that.
Well, I kind of think it's just anyone that's other, other than us. And it could be anybody, anywhere. It's just the others. They're different than us because they don't do this or they don't do that. I think of the old Dr. Seuss book, The Starbelly Sneetches. They had stars and then they didn't have stars, and it's the same thing. It's like they're really not different, but some had stars and some didn't, and then they wanted stars, and anyway, long story. But I think that's just others.
I was going to say other denominations, but that kind of falls into that one.
Right, and I think kind of what you were saying, Eric, sometimes in our efforts to make sure that we don't stray, or, there's a fine line between, I don't know how to explain this very well, but between not wanting to get caught up in a group that is going to lead you the wrong way or that you shouldn't be around, but understanding that there are times when you have to cross that line and you have to reach out, that you can't stay separate from this world entirely, because that leaves no one to minister to, if that makes some sense. I mean, like for us in healthcare, we do get called to minister to people that would not normally. I mean, I remember the first time I was at Parkland, nursing student, little aide, and I walk in and there's somebody chained to the bed and there's a guard next to him, right? That was weird. That's weird for me because I didn't grow up like that. My parents never, I had no connection and no dealing, if that makes sense. But you have to look beyond that and say, well, I'm here, I have to minister during this portion. I think sometimes Christians we're very good at saying, well, I don't do that because I can't be around those kind of people, right? But those kind of people are us. We have more alike, like Susan said, we're more alike than we are different. And I think so many times that we allow others to play up the differences, more, and we listen to them, and I think too, it must have been pretty scary for the Samaritan to have someone helping them that they knew was supposed to hate them. And I think sometimes we have to remember that too when we're approaching other people. We have to approach them on their terms. They may be scared of us, right? That depends on what their past history is with someone who looks and thinks like us, right?
Yeah. I actually have a note that I didn't bring out, which you kind of chimed on. Not who is the Samaritan of the day, but who's our prostitute of the day? Who's the people with the leprosy of today? Who do we not want to touch? Who do we not want to communicate with? Who do we say are so unclean that they're not allowed into our churches? That was the prostitutes of those days. And where do we have that line or non-line, or the one which has, ELCA has switched views on, which would be gays within our community of a whole. Also, women pastors for a while was very looked down upon. 10 years ago, we had the scare of Muslims, and so there are some of those. I see that a couple people unmuted, so I'm going to stop talking.
Well, I was thinking the quickest way to change Susan's others into us is by just communicating with them. If you've got a good friend who's gay or a Muslim or any of these other categories, you probably won't categorize them as others anymore.
Well, I think before we can take that step, we have to step out of our humanness in a way where we always look for the differences. Let's look for the similarities.
Love thy neighbor as thyself.
There was one of the churches that I was associated with as a boy decided to go over to the American Lutheran Church because they had a very strong feeling against gays. But then after they changed, they went ahead and got a new organist who happened to be gay, and then they gained a new insight into that other person.
One of my favorite stories when I was in high school that I read was back in the early 40s, 50s, say early, but it was during the KKK stuff, and basically there was a town meeting where they wanted to talk about the children, and 2 people were put onto this board to talk about the kids in the community. One happens to be a big black woman, and the other happened to be the head of the KKK in that area. And they had to come together, and it was written by him. And so basically the overall is he hated it and hated it and hated it. And then slowly being next to that person, he slowly started falling in love with that person, not in a romantic way, but as a spiritual way. And how that grew, where those 2 ended up being the people that said, no, we need to do better within this community. And through those 2, it grew from that community.
They made a movie out of it. I can't remember. It was very good. Watched it during COVID, but yeah, it's a true story. It's pretty amazing.
Well, that's the stop focusing on our differences and find that common ground.
And I know that everybody's time is precious, so we are hitting at that time. Does anybody else want to add anything else before we end in prayer? Anybody?
Well, do we want to jump and do the spiritual personalities real fast, at least, Eric?
Very true. Sorry, we're going to do that real fast.
All right, I'm not going to go back into presentation mode.
No, that's fine. So basically, like we have been doing, giving everybody something that they had and then needed to learn. James being overly passionate and running kind of blindly and into things, he needed to get humbled. Humbled to be able to see the next person next to him. And so that was my word that I ended up, or the 2 that I just decided best fit him. So does anybody want to lead us in the Lord's Prayer? Lorraine, yeah.
Couldn't find the unmute. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Amen.
I don't know about you, hearing that, it kind of, I don't know what's going on. But it impacts me more after knowing all of these things that we've been learning. Like hearing each line impacts me a little bit more by a little bit more. But that's it for the week. We are going into John next week. If you want to stick around and talk for a second, please feel free. But like I said, I want to respect everybody's time. So thank you for this week. This was amazing. Love all of you. Can't wait to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
I just want to say, Cindy, I wish I grew up next to you.
Well, I grew up in Houston.
I'm sorry.
You're in luck. You guys both go to the same church now.
Oh, it is. That's right.
Who's still recording?
I didn't record.
It stopped.